The spoon trembled in Jerry Davidson's hand as he watched his 8-year-old son struggle with lunch, but it was the gentle stranger who knelt beside their table and whispered, "Hey sweetie, want to see a magic trick with this mac and cheese?" Who would change everything. The morning sun cast harsh shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Jerry Davidson's penthouse, illuminating a breakfast scene that looked more like a business negotiation than a father feeding his son. David's designer suit was already wrinkled at 8 a.m., his tie loosened from the battle that breakfast had become. "Come on, Timothy. Just 3 more bites," Jerry coaxed, holding the spoon of scrambled eggs toward his 8-year-old son, who sat strapped into his adaptive chair, his small body twisted by cerebral palsy but his dark eyes bright with intelligence and frustration. Matthew turned his head away, a sound of protest escaping his lips. The eggs fell to the pristine marble floor with a wet splat, joining the orange juice from 10 minutes earlier and the toast from 15 minutes before that. Jerry closed his eyes, counting to 10 the way the therapists had taught him. When he opened them, Matthew was watching him with those knowing eyes that seemed to see straight through all of David's carefully constructed defenses. "I'm sorry, buddy," Jerry whispered, his voice cracking slightly. "Daddy's trying his best." The truth was, Jerry Davidson could negotiate million-dollar deals before lunch, could read market trends like others read picture books, and had built a tech empire from nothing. But feeding his son breakfast felt like climbing Mount Everest in dress shoes. Every morning was a reminder that all his success meant nothing when he couldn't perform the most basic act of fatherhood. Matthew made a soft sound, reaching his less affected left hand toward David's face. Jerry leaned in, feeling his son's fingers brush against his cheek, a gesture that always melted his heart and broke it simultaneously. "What do you think, Tim? Should we try somewhere else for lunch today? Maybe that little diner we passed last week?" Jerry asked, though he knew Matthew couldn't answer with words. But something in his son's expression shifted, became more alert. "What do you think? Should parents always push through difficult moments alone, or is asking for help sometimes the bravest choice? Let me know in the comments below." Across town, Chelsea Whitney was already 3 hours into her shift at Rosie's Diner, her feet aching in the worn sneakers that were held together more by hope than rubber. She moved between tables with practiced efficiency, coffee pot in one hand, order pad in the other, her smile genuine despite the exhaustion that had become her constant companion. "More coffee, Mr. Peterson?" she asked the elderly man who came in every Tuesday, sitting in the same booth, ordering the same meal, and leaving the same 50-cent tip. Chelsea had learned not to expect more, from tips, from people, from life in general. "You're a good girl, Chelsea," Mr. Peterson said, patting her hand with his weathered one. "Don't know why some man hasn't snatched you up yet." Chelsea's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. At 24, she'd learned that being snatched up usually meant being used up and discarded. The foster homes had taught her that lesson early, and the few relationships she'd attempted had only reinforced it. "Just focused on school right now," she replied diplomatically, topping off his cup. It wasn't entirely untrue. She was taking night classes in early childhood development, though some weeks she was too exhausted to attend. Her dream of working with special needs children felt as distant as the moon some days. The diner's bell chimed, and Chelsea looked up to see a mother struggling with twin toddlers, looking frazzled and overwhelmed. Without thinking, Chelsea grabbed 2 coloring pages and crayons from behind the counter. "These might help keep them busy while you look at the menu," she offered, kneeling down to the children's level. Their faces lit up, and their mother looked at Chelsea with such gratitude it made her chest tight. "Thank you so much. You're an angel." Chelsea stood, brushing off her apron. Angel. If only they knew about the nights she cried herself to sleep, wondering if she'd ever be enough for anyone to stay. The lunch rush was beginning, and Chelsea steeled herself for the next 6 hours of aching feet, demanding customers, and the constant mental calculation of tips versus bills. Her phone buzzed with a text from her evening job at the cleaning company. They needed her to come in early. She sighed, calculating quickly. If she left here at 3, grabbed a granola bar instead of lunch, she could make it to the office building by 3:30, clean until 11 p.m., and still have time to review her child development textbook before falling into bed. Then up at 5 a.m. to do it all again. But as she watched the family with the twins share their meal, the children now quietly coloring, something warm spread through her chest. This was why she did it. These moments when she could make someone's day a little easier, a little brighter. She didn't know that across town, a millionaire father was buckling his disabled son into a car seat, making a decision that would change both their lives forever. Jerry adjusted Timothy's harness one more time, checking and double-checking the way he always did. Matthew tolerated his father's anxious fussing with patience that broke David's heart. An 8-year-old shouldn't have to be so understanding of adult inadequacy. "Ready for an adventure, Tim?" Jerry asked, though adventure was probably too strong a word for lunch at a small diner. For David, who usually ate catered meals in boardrooms or takeout at his desk, this qualified as stepping into unknown territory. Matthew made a happy sound, and Jerry chose to interpret it as excitement. Maybe, just maybe, today would be different. Maybe he'd figure out how to be the father Matthew deserved, instead of just the one he'd been given. As David's Tesla pulled out of the underground garage and Chelsea wiped down table 6 for the 3rd time that morning, neither of them could have imagined that their carefully separate worlds were about to collide in the most unexpected way. The lunch crowd at Rosie's diner was in full swing when Jerry Davidson pushed through the glass door, Timothy's wheelchair navigating the narrow entrance with some difficulty. The familiar sounds hit him immediately, the clatter of dishes, the hum of conversation, the sizzle from the grill, so different from the sterile quiet of his penthouse or corporate offices. Chelsea looked up from wiping down the counter, her practiced eye immediately assessing the new customers. The man in the expensive suit looked completely out of place, but it was the little boy in the wheelchair who caught her attention. He had the most beautiful dark eyes she'd ever seen, bright with curiosity as he took in the bustling diner. "Just 2?" Chelsea asked, grabbing menus from behind the register. "Yes, please," Jerry replied, his voice softer than she'd expected. "Somewhere, quiet, if possible." Chelsea glanced around the crowded diner, then at Timothy, who was trying to reach for the small bell that hung from the door. Something in the way the father watched his son, protective, loving, but tinged with worry, made her heart squeeze. "I've got the perfect spot," she said, leading them to a corner booth away from the main traffic flow. "This okay?" Jerry started to lift Matthew from his chair, and Chelsea could see the careful way he moved, the practiced motions of someone who'd done this countless times but still approached each transfer with nervous precision. "His name's Timothy," Jerry said as he settled his son into the booth, adjusting pillows he'd brought to support Timothy's posture. "Tim, this is—" He looked up at Chelsea's name tag. "Chelsea." "Hi, Timothy," Chelsea said, crouching down to the boy's eye level. "I love your dinosaur shirt. Is that a T-Rex?" Timothy's face lit up, and he made an excited sound, his left hand reaching toward Chelsea's face. Jerry tensed, ready to redirect his son's hand, but Chelsea didn't flinch. She let Matthew touch her cheek, smiling as if it was the most natural thing in the world. "He likes you," Jerry said, his voice tight with an emotion Chelsea couldn't identify. "I like him too," Chelsea replied simply. "What can I get you guys to drink?" Jerry ordered coffee and chocolate milk for Timothy, though he worried aloud about the sugar content and whether the straw would work with Timothy's cup. Chelsea listened patiently to his concerns, then returned with a chocolate milk in a cup with a lid and a bent straw, exactly what Matthew needed without Jerry having to explain. "How did you know?" Jerry asked. Chelsea shrugged. "I'm studying child development. You pick up things." When it came time to order food, Jerry chose the safest option he could find, mac and cheese for Timothy, something soft and manageable. Chelsea took the order and headed to the Kit Davidson, but she found herself glancing back at their table more often than usual. The food arrived 15 minutes later, and that's when everything changed. Jerry had positioned Timothy's plate carefully, cut the mac and cheese into smaller pieces, and was holding the adaptive spoon they traveled with everywhere. But Matthew was having a difficult day. His motor control was worse than usual, and the spoon kept slipping from his grasp. "Come on, buddy," Jerry whispered, his own hands beginning to shake as he tried to guide Timothy's. "You can do this." Matthew made a frustrated sound, his body tensing as he struggled. A glob of cheese sauce landed on his shirt, then another on the table. David's face flushed as he noticed other diners beginning to stare. "It's okay, Tim. Let Daddy help," Jerry said, reaching for the spoon, but Matthew pulled away, his frustration growing. The sound Matthew made was louder now, drawing more attention. David's hands were definitely shaking as he tried to clean up the mess, his designer suit sleeve dragging through the spilled food. He could feel eyes on them, could sense the uncomfortable shifting of other customers. "I'm sorry," Jerry whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was apologizing to Timothy, to the other diners, or to himself for being such a failure at this basic task. Timothy's distress was escalating, his body rigid with frustration and sensory overload. Jerry felt the familiar panic rising in his chest, the same feeling he got every time he couldn't figure out what Matthew needed, couldn't bridge the gap between his love for his son and his ability to help him. Then Chelsea appeared beside their table. She didn't announce herself or ask permission. She simply slid into the booth next to Timothy, her movements slow and calm. She picked up a clean spoon and scooped up a small bite of mac and cheese. "Hey, sweetie," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Want to see a magic trick?" Timothy's crying stopped almost immediately, his attention caught by Chelsea's gentle tone. She held the spoon up like a tiny airplane. "This is Captain Mac," she said seriously, "and he's flying through the clouds looking for the perfect landing spot." She made gentle whooshing sounds as she moved the spoon in slow loops through the air. "Do you think he should land on planet Timothy?" Timothy's eyes followed the spoon, fascination replacing frustration. When Chelsea brought the airplane to his lips, he opened his mouth automatically, the mac and cheese disappearing without struggle. "Excellent landing, Captain Mac," Chelsea announced. "The people of Planet Matthew are very happy." She continued the game, turning each bite into a small adventure. A piece of cheese became a golden treasure, a small noodle became a friendly worm saying hello. Matthew ate steadily, his body relaxed, occasional giggles escaping as Chelsea created increasingly elaborate stories for each bite. Jerry sat frozen, watching this stranger accomplish in minutes what he struggled with every single meal. But it wasn't jealousy he felt, it was something deeper, more profound. It was recognition. Chelsea wasn't just feeding his son. She was seeing him. Really seeing him, not as a disabled child to be pitied or managed, but as a little boy who loved stories and imagination and being treated like any other kid. When Matthew had finished most of his meal, Chelsea used a napkin to gently clean his face, still maintaining the playful narrative. "Captain Mac's mission is complete," she announced. "Planet Matthew is safe for another day." Matthew reached for Chelsea's hand, holding it against his cheek the way he sometimes did with Jerry when he was especially content. Chelsea didn't pull away, didn't seem uncomfortable with the intimate gesture. That's when Jerry felt it, the crack in the wall he'd built around his heart. Not just because of what Chelsea had done, but because of how she'd done it. With such natural grace, such instinctive understanding, such genuine joy in Timothy's happiness. "How?" David's voice came out as barely a whisper. Chelsea looked at him then, really looked at him, and Jerry felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with his expensive suit or his net worth. She was seeing past all of that, straight to the scared father who loved his son desperately but felt like he was failing him every single day. "He's amazing," Chelsea said simply. "He just needed someone to speak his language." The words hit Jerry like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. Matthew had been trying to communicate with him for 8 years, and Jerry had been so focused on fixing, on managing, on curing, that he'd forgotten to simply connect. Chelsea stood to leave, but Matthew made a sound of protest, reaching for her. She looked at Jerry questioningly. "He doesn't want you to go," Jerry said, his voice thick with emotion. "I have other tables," Chelsea said gently, "but I'll check on you guys, okay, Timothy?" As Chelsea walked away, Jerry watched his son's eyes follow her across the diner. Matthew was still calm, still content, but there was something new in his expression. Hope, maybe, or the kind of happiness that came from being truly understood. Here's what I'm wondering. Do you think some people are just naturally gifted at connecting with others, or is it a skill that can be learned? Share your thoughts below. Jerry sat in the aftermath of what had just happened, trying to process the emotions flooding through him. Gratitude, certainly. Amazement at what he'd witnessed. But underneath it all was something more unsettling. The recognition that in 5 minutes, this young waitress had given his son something Jerry had been trying to provide for 8 years. When Chelsea returned to check on them 20 minutes later, Timothy's face lit up like Christmas morning. She ruffled his hair gently, asked if he wanted more chocolate milk, and treated him with the same easy affection she might show any child. "Thank you," Jerry said when she brought the check. The words felt inadequate for what she'd done. For what? Chelsea asked, genuinely confused. "For seeing him," Jerry replied. "For seeing Timothy." Chelsea's expression softened. "He's easy to see. He's got the best smile in the whole diner." As if summoned, Matthew beamed at her, and Chelsea laughed, a sound so warm and genuine that Jerry felt something shift in his chest, something he'd thought was permanently broken. When they prepared to leave, Jerry left a tip that was larger than Chelsea's usual daily take in tips. But as he lifted Matthew back into his wheelchair, he realized that no amount of money could repay what had happened at that table. Chelsea had given him something priceless, a glimpse of who his son really was beneath the disability, and a mirror reflecting his own shortcomings not as failures, but as opportunities to do better. As Jerry pushed Timothy's wheelchair toward the door, he heard his son make the happy sound that meant he was content, truly content, for the first time in weeks. And for the first time in 8 years, Jerry Davidson felt like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't completely failing as a father. Jerry Davidson sat in his Tesla for 10 full minutes after buckling Matthew into his car seat, staring at the diner through the windshield. His hands were still trembling slightly, not from the usual anxiety of feeding Timothy, but from something else entirely. Something that felt dangerously close to hope. Matthew was making soft, contented sounds in the back seat, occasionally saying Chelsea in his unclear but determined way. Each repetition of her name sent a jolt through David's chest. "We should go home, Tim," Jerry said, starting the engine. But even as he pulled out of the parking lot, he found himself glancing in the rearview mirror at the small diner growing smaller behind them. Back in his penthouse an hour later, Jerry tried to lose himself in work. He had 3 conference calls scheduled, 2 acquisition reports to review, and a presentation to finalize for tomorrow's board meeting. But every time he looked at his laptop screen, he saw Chelsea's gentle hands guiding the spoon, heard her soft voice turning lunch into an adventure. He called his assistant, Rebecca. "Cancel my 3 p.m. with Morrison," he said. "Sir?" "That meeting's been scheduled for 3 weeks. The Singapore deal." "Reschedule it." "And Rebecca?" "Find me information on early childhood development programs. The best ones. Money no object." There was a pause. "For Timothy, sir?" "Yes. No. Maybe." Jerry rubbed his temples. "Just send me what you find." After hanging up, Jerry walked to Timothy's playroom, where his son was working with his physical therapist, Janet. She was a competent woman in her 50s who had excellent credentials and charged accordingly. Jerry watched her guide Matthew through his exercises with professional efficiency. "How was lunch out?" Janet asked, helping Matthew stretch his legs. "Fine," Jerry said quickly. Too quickly. Janet looked at him curiously. "Matthew seems more relaxed today. Different somehow." Jerry felt that crack in his chest widen. "Different how?" "Happier, I think. More engaged." Jerry excused himself and retreated to his office. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city below, but his mind kept drifting back to a small corner booth where magic had happened with mac and cheese. This was ridiculous. Chelsea was just doing her job, being kind to a customer. That's what good servers did. they made people feel comfortable. There was nothing more to it than professional courtesy and perhaps natural compassion. But even as he told himself this, Jerry couldn't shake the image of Timothy's face lighting up when Chelsea appeared beside their table. His son had smiled more in those 20 minutes than Jerry had seen in weeks. Jerry opened his laptop and typed Rosie's Diner into the search bar, then immediately closed it. This was foolish. He was a successful businessman, not some lovesick teenager stalking a waitress online. His phone buzzed with a text from his brother James. "How's my favorite nephew? Still on for dinner Sunday?" Jerry stared at the message. James had been asking him to bring Matthew to family dinners for months, but Jerry always found excuses. The truth was, he dreaded those gatherings, watching his brother's children run and play while Matthew sat in his wheelchair, seeing the mixture of pity and discomfort in his relative's eyes. But today, something was different. Today he'd seen Matthew through Chelsea's eyes, not as a burden or a tragedy, but as a little boy with the best smile in the diner. "We'll be there," he typed back. Meanwhile, across town, Chelsea was having her own crisis of confusion. She'd finished her shift at the diner and was now pushing a vacuum cleaner across the marble floors of Davidson Technologies' downtown office building, though she didn't know the connection. Her evening cleaning job was mindless work that usually gave her time to think, but tonight her thoughts kept circling back to the father and son from lunch. She couldn't stop thinking about the little boy's beautiful eyes, or the way his father had looked at her when she'd helped with the feeding, like she performed some kind of miracle instead of just being decent to a child. The tip had been outrageous. $300 for a $20 meal. Chelsea had stared at the receipt for 5 full minutes, sure there had been some mistake. But the signature was clear, and when she'd run the card, it had gone through without issue. $300. That was more than she made in a week at the diner, enough to cover her textbooks for next semester or fix the transmission in her beat-up Honda. It should have made her happy. Instead, it made her uncomfortable. Rich people didn't leave tips like that unless they wanted something, and Chelsea had learned long ago to be suspicious of unexpected generosity. In her experience, every gift came with strings attached, every kindness had a price that would be collected later. She'd seen the way Jerry looked at her, intense, searching, like he was trying to figure something out. Men who looked at her like that usually wanted one of two things. Either they saw her as a charity case to make themselves feel better, or they saw her as something else entirely. Chelsea had been both, and neither experience had ended well. She finished vacuuming the executive floor and moved on to dusting the conference room. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see the city spread out below, all those lights representing lives she'd never touch, worlds she'd never be part of. That was fine with her. Chelsea had learned not to want things that weren't meant for her. The moment you started hoping for more than you deserved, life had a way of reminding you exactly where you belonged. But as she wiped down the conference table, she couldn't stop thinking about Timothy's laugh when she'd made the mac and cheese into Captain Mac. She'd worked with children in various foster homes and volunteer positions over the years, but there had been something special about connecting with that little boy. Something that had felt natural and right in a way that so little in her life ever had. Her phone buzzed with a text from her roommate Jessica. "Rent's due Thursday. You good for your half?" Chelsea calculated quickly in her head. With the tip from today, she was actually ahead for once. She could pay rent, buy groceries, and still have enough left over for her car payment. "Yeah, I'm good," she texted back. But even as she sent the message, she felt uneasy. The tip felt too much like fairy tale money, the kind that disappeared when you woke up from the dream. Chelsea had learned not to count on windfalls, because they always came with complications. She thought about the way Jerry had struggled to feed his son, the frustration and embarrassment clear on his face. Chelsea recognized that look. She'd seen it in the mirror often enough. It was the look of someone trying their best and feeling like it wasn't good enough. Maybe the large tip hadn't been about pity or ulterior motives. Maybe it had just been gratitude from a father who'd watched his son be happy for a few precious minutes. But even if that were true, it didn't change anything. Chelsea's life was carefully balanced on a knife's edge of multiple jobs and night classes and dreams that felt increasingly distant. She couldn't afford to get distracted by beautiful little boys with bright eyes and their complicated fathers, no matter how generous their tips might be. As she finished her shift and headed home to her cramped apartment, Chelsea made a decision. If Jerry and Matthew came back to the diner, she'd be polite and professional. Nothing more. She'd learned long ago that getting too attached to the people who passed through her life only led to heartbreak when they inevitably moved on. What she didn't expect was that Matthew would have other plans entirely. Back in his penthouse, Jerry was reading Matthew his bedtime story, a routine that usually involved more frustration than bonding as Timothy's attention wandered and Jerry struggled to make the characters come alive. But tonight was different. Matthew was focused, engaged, making happy sounds at all the right moments. When Jerry finished the book, Matthew looked at him expectantly. "More story?" Jerry asked. Matthew pointed to himself, then made a flying motion with his hand. It took Jerry a moment to understand. "You want to hear about Captain Mac?" Timothy's face lit up, and he clapped his hands together. Jerry felt that crack in his chest widen further. His son was asking him to recreate the magic that Chelsea had made with a simple spoon and some imagination. The problem was, Jerry had no idea how to be magical. But looking at Timothy's hopeful face, Jerry knew he had to try. "Okay," he said, settling back into the chair beside Timothy's bed. Once upon a time, there was a brave little spaceship captain named Mac. As Jerry stumbled through an improvised story about flying food and intergalactic adventures, he realized something that both thrilled and terrified him. Matthew wasn't just asking for another story. He was asking Jerry to be the kind of father who could create wonder out of ordinary moments. The kind of father Chelsea had shown him it was possible to be. And despite every logical reason to stay away from that diner and the woman who worked there, Jerry knew with absolute certainty that they would be back tomorrow. Because for the first time in 8 years, his son had shown him who he wanted to become. The next day arrived with Timothy's determined pointing toward the door at 11:30 a.m., 30 minutes before his usual lunchtime. Jerry had tried to distract him with toys, with television, even with a promise of ice cream later, but Matthew was resolute in his silent communication. "Chelsea," Matthew said clearly, one of the few words he could pronounce distinctly. "Chelsea." David's chest tightened. He'd spent half the night telling himself they wouldn't return to the diner, that yesterday had been a one-time occurrence, a moment of weakness brought on by desperation and gratitude. But looking at his son's determined expression, Jerry realized he was fighting a losing battle. "All right, Tim. Let's go see Chelsea." The drive to Rosie's diner felt different this time. Yesterday had been impulsive, almost accidental. Today felt intentional, like crossing a line Jerry wasn't sure he was ready to cross. Chelsea spotted them the moment they walked through the door. She'd been wiping down the same table for the third time, her stomach doing small flips every time the bell chimed, though she refused to acknowledge why. When she saw Timothy's face light up at the sight of her, something warm and dangerous bloomed in her chest. "Well, look who's back," she said, approaching their table with what she hoped was professional friendliness. "Same booth as yesterday?" "Chelsea!" Matthew exclaimed, reaching for her hand. Jerry watched the interaction with an intensity that made Chelsea's skin prickle. There was something hungry in his gaze, not predatory, but desperate in a way that made her want to simultaneously run toward him and away from him. "He's been asking for you all morning," Jerry admitted quietly. "I tried to explain that you might not be working today, but Matthew knows what he wants," Chelsea finished, settling Matthew into the booth with the same easy competence she'd shown yesterday. Over the next week, the pattern established itself. Matthew would begin asking for Chelsea by mid-morning, and Jerry would find himself driving to the diner despite every rational argument his brain provided. Chelsea began saving their corner booth, anticipating their arrival. Each visit revealed new layers. Jerry learned that Chelsea was 24, working 3 jobs to put herself through school, studying early childhood development with a focus on special needs. Chelsea discovered that Jerry had started his tech company after college, that Timothy's mother had died giving birth to him, that Jerry often worked 18-hour days to avoid going home to his own inadequacy as a father. Why special needs? Jerry asked one afternoon, watching Chelsea help Matthew with his chocolate milk. Chelsea was quiet for so long that Jerry thought she wouldn't answer. Finally, she said, "I grew up in foster care. There was this boy, Marcus, in one of my homes. He had autism, couldn't speak. The other kids ignored him, but I used to sit with him during meals. He never looked at me directly, but sometimes he'd put his hand near mine on the table, like he was saying thank you." She paused, adjusting Timothy's straw. "One day I found him crying in the closet. The foster parents said he was having a tantrum, but I could tell he was scared. The washing machine was running, and the sound was too much for him. So I sat with him in the closet until it stopped." Matthew reached up and touched Chelsea's cheek, sensing the emotion in her voice. 3 days later, he got moved to a different home. I never saw him again. Chelsea's voice was steady, but Jerry could see the old pain in her eyes. "I kept thinking that if I understood better, if I knew more, maybe I could have helped him more. Maybe I could help kids like him find their voices." Jerry felt something shift inside his chest. "Is that why you're so good with Timothy?" Chelsea shrugged. "I just listen to what he's actually saying instead of what I think he should be saying." The words hit Jerry like a physical blow. How many times had he tried to force Matthew to fit into David's idea of normal instead of meeting his son where he was? By Thursday of that week, their routine had expanded beyond meals. Chelsea's shift ended at 3 p.m., and Jerry found himself asking if she'd like to join them at the park nearby. Timothy's delight was so obvious that Chelsea couldn't refuse. Watching Chelsea push Timothy's wheelchair down the paved path, pointing out birds and flowers and making up stories about the other people they passed, Jerry felt something he hadn't experienced in years: peace. Not the bought and paid for peace of his penthouse or his office, but the deep settled peace that came from watching his son be genuinely happy. "He's amazing, you know," Chelsea said, settling on a bench while Matthew watched a group of children play on the nearby playground. "His communication skills are incredible. He just uses a different language than most people." Jerry joined her on the bench, close enough to smell her shampoo, something simple and clean, not the expensive perfumes he was used to. "I never know what he needs. Half the time I feel like I'm guessing." "Maybe that's okay," Chelsea said softly. "Maybe he doesn't need you to have all the answers. Maybe he just needs you to keep trying." Jerry looked at her, then really looked at her. Chelsea Whitney was beautiful, but not in the polished, artificial way of the women who usually moved in his circles. Her beauty was honest, the kind that came from genuine kindness and hard-earned strength. When she smiled at Timothy, her whole face lit up, and Jerry found himself wanting to be the cause of that smile. "Can I ask you something?" Jerry said. Chelsea nodded, though something cautious flickered in her expression. "Why do you work so hard? 3 jobs, school. There has to be an easier way." Chelsea was quiet for a moment, watching Timothy. When you grow up with nothing, you learn that the only person you can count on is yourself. "I work hard because I have to. Because the moment I stop, the moment I depend on someone else, that's when everything falls apart." Jerry felt a strange urge to tell her that she could depend on him, that he could make her life easier with a single phone call. But something in her tone warned him that such an offer would be unwelcome. Friday afternoon brought an unexpected complication. David's business partner, Richard Morrison, called just as they were leaving the park. "David, where the hell are you? The Yamamoto meeting was moved to 4 p.m. today. They're flying back to Tokyo tonight if we don't close this deal." David's blood went cold. The Yamamoto deal represented 6 months of negotiations and a potential $50 million contract. "I thought it was Monday." "Schedule change. I sent 3 emails. Are you not checking your phone?" Jerry realized with horror that he'd been so focused on Chelsea and Matthew that he'd barely looked at his phone all afternoon. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. David, this deal." "I know. I'll be there." Jerry hung up and turned to Chelsea, who was helping Matthew back into his wheelchair. "I have to go. Emergency meeting." Chelsea nodded, understanding immediately. Of course. Business comes first. But Matthew began to cry when Jerry started to strap him into his car seat. Real tears, the kind of heartbroken sobbing that Matthew rarely displayed. "Hey, what's wrong, buddy?" Jerry asked, but Matthew just reached toward Chelsea. "He doesn't want the afternoon to end," Chelsea said softly. "And honestly, neither do I." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither was ready to examine too closely. Jerry looked at his watch. The meeting was across town. In traffic it would take 30 minutes. If he left now, he might make it on time. But Matthew was inconsolable, and Jerry felt torn between his professional obligations and his son's needs. "I could stay with him," Chelsea offered quietly. "Just until your meeting's over. If that would help." Jerry stared at her. "You don't even know me. Why would you?" "Because he needs someone who understands him right now, and you need to go save your business deal." Chelsea's voice was matter-of-fact. "It's not complicated." But it was complicated, Jerry realized. Letting Chelsea watch Matthew meant trusting her with the most precious thing in his world. It meant admitting that his son was happier with her than with him. It meant acknowledging that this woman he'd known for less than a week had become somehow essential to their lives. "My apartment is close," Chelsea continued. "Matthew and I could hang out there for a couple hours. I don't have to work tonight." Jerry hesitated. Everything about this situation screamed bad idea. He barely knew Chelsea, he was potentially putting Matthew at risk, and he was definitely crossing professional boundaries with someone he was clearly developing feelings for. But Matthew had stopped crying the moment Chelsea made her offer, and was now looking hopefully between the two adults. "Are you sure?" Jerry asked. Chelsea smiled, and Jerry felt that familiar crack in his chest widen. "I'm sure. Go save the world, Mr. Davidson. Matthew and I will be fine." As Jerry handed over Timothy's emergency bag and rattled off instructions about medications and feeding times, he realized this was the first time in 8 years he'd left his son with someone who wasn't a paid professional. And for the first time in 8 years, he wasn't worried. He was terrified of something else entirely, the growing certainty that Chelsea Whitney was becoming far more important to him than any business deal ever could be. Chelsea's apartment was a stark contrast to anywhere Matthew had ever been. The one-bedroom space was clean but cramped, furnished with second-hand pieces that showed their age. But Matthew seemed fascinated by everything: the cheerful yellow curtains Chelsea had sewn herself, the small succulent plants lined up on the windowsill, the stack of early childhood development textbooks on the coffee table. "Welcome to my palace," Chelsea said with self-deprecating humor, lifting Matthew from his wheelchair onto her small couch. She'd arranged pillows to support him the way she'd watched Jerry do countless times. Matthew looked around with bright curiosity, his gaze settling on a framed photograph on Chelsea's side table. It showed a much younger Chelsea, maybe 16, standing with a group of other teenagers in front of what looked like a group home. "That's from my last foster placement," Chelsea said, noticing his interest. "Right before I aged out of the system." She settled beside Timothy, pulling out her phone to show him pictures of dinosaurs. She'd learned that was his current obsession. But Matthew kept looking at the photograph, then at Chelsea, as if trying to understand something. "You want to know about that picture?" Chelsea asked softly. Matthew nodded, his expression serious in the way that made him seem older than his 8 years. Chelsea picked up the frame, running her finger along the edge. "I lived in 12 different homes before I turned 18. Some were okay, some weren't. But that last one, Riverside Group Home, that's where I learned that family isn't always about blood." She pointed to a tall boy in the back row. "That's James." He protected the younger kids. And Sarah there, she taught me how to braid hair. Marcus was the one I told your dad about, the boy with autism who couldn't speak but had the kindest eyes. Matthew reached toward the photo, touching the glass over Chelsea's younger face. I know I look different, Chelsea said. Skinnier. Sadder, maybe. I was so angry back then. Angry at my birth parents for leaving me, angry at the system for shuffling me around, angry at myself for thinking I wasn't worth staying for. Chelsea set the photo down, her voice growing quieter. The thing about growing up in care is that you learn early that everyone leaves. Foster parents who decide you're too much trouble, social workers who get reassigned, other kids who get adopted. So you stop trying to make them stay. You stop believing you're worth staying for. She looked at Timothy, who was watching her with those remarkably perceptive eyes. But you know what I learned? Sometimes the family you make is stronger than the family you're born into. Those kids in that picture, we looked out for each other. We became each other's people. Matthew made a soft sound and leaned against Chelsea's shoulder. She wrapped her arm around him, the gesture as natural as breathing. Your dad, he loves you so much it radiates off him, Chelsea continued. Sometimes I think that scares him, loving someone that much when he's already lost so much. Chelsea's phone buzzed with a text from David. Meeting running late. Everything okay? She typed back, perfect. Timothy's teaching me about dinosaurs. But as she sent the message, Chelsea noticed Matthew had gone very still. He was staring at her phone, and suddenly his expression crumpled. Tears began streaming down his face, not the frustrated crying she'd seen at the diner, but deep, heartbroken sobs. Oh, sweetie, what's wrong? Chelsea asked, pulling him closer. Matthew pointed at her phone, then at himself, his small body shaking with the force of his crying. It took Chelsea a moment to understand. Matthew was crying because his father had left him again. Because Jerry was at another meeting, choosing work over time with his son. Because even though Jerry loved him, Matthew could feel that he came second to the demands of David's business. Timothy, honey, your dad will be back, Chelsea said gently. He's working so hard because he wants to take care of you. But Matthew just cried harder, and Chelsea realized this wasn't about David's current absence. This was about a pattern Matthew had learned to expect, that he would always be secondary to something more important. Chelsea held him until the tears subsided, humming softly the way she used to comfort the younger children in her foster homes. When Matthew finally calmed down, he looked at her with such trust that her heart broke a little. Can I tell you a secret? Chelsea whispered. Sometimes grown-ups work too much because they're scared. Your daddy works so hard because he's afraid he's not good enough for you. But you know what? You're the most important thing in his whole world. He just hasn't figured out how to show you that yet. Meanwhile, across town, Jerry was sitting in his office conference room trying to focus on projected earnings and market analyses, but his mind kept drifting to Chelsea's small apartment. He'd never left Matthew with someone who wasn't a trained professional, and the trust he'd placed in Chelsea felt both terrifying and oddly liberating. David, are you listening? Richard Morrison's voice cut through his distraction. Jerry snapped back to attention. Sorry. The quarterly projections for the Tokyo division. That was 10 minutes ago. We're on implementation timelines now. David's phone buzzed with another text from Chelsea, a photo of Matthew on her couch, surrounded by dinosaur books, grinning at the camera. The image hit Jerry like a physical blow. When was the last time he'd seen Matthew look that relaxed and happy? As the meeting droned on, Jerry found himself thinking about what Chelsea had said at the park about Matthew just needing him to keep trying. How long had it been since Jerry had actually played with his son instead of just managing his care? The truth was, Jerry had been running from fatherhood since the day Matthew was born. Not literally, he'd never abandoned his responsibilities, but emotionally. The doctors had delivered Timothy's diagnosis with clinical detachment, cerebral palsy, significant motor delays, speech difficulties. They'd handed Jerry a list of therapists and specialists and told him Matthew would need lifelong care. What they hadn't told him was how to love a child whose needs felt so far beyond his capabilities. David's wife, Lynn, had died from complications 3 days after Timothy's birth. Jerry had gone from anticipating normal new parent challenges to facing single parenthood of a special needs child while grieving his wife's death. He'd thrown himself into work because work made sense. Work had problems with solutions, challenges that money and intelligence could overcome. Timothy's needs felt infinite and unfixable. But watching Chelsea with Matthew over the past week had shown Jerry something he'd never considered. Maybe Matthew didn't need to be fixed. Maybe Matthew just needed to be loved for exactly who he was. David's phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Chelsea. Matthew fell asleep. He's okay, but he was crying earlier. I think he misses you more than you realize. The words hit Jerry in the chest. He looked around the conference room at the charts and graphs and profit projections, and suddenly none of it seemed as important as getting back to his son. Richard, I need to go, Jerry said, standing abruptly. David, we haven't finished. Email me the details. I'll review everything tonight. Jerry was already gathering his papers. But right now, my son needs me. Richard looked at him as if he'd lost his mind. In 8 years of partnership, Jerry had never left a meeting early for personal reasons. But as Jerry drove toward Chelsea's apartment, he realized something had fundamentally shifted inside him. For years, he'd been trying to be the kind of father he thought Matthew needed: responsible, providing, protective. What he'd never tried to be was simply present. Chelsea had shown him that Matthew didn't need a perfect father. He just needed his father. When Jerry knocked on Chelsea's apartment door 20 minutes later, she opened it with a finger to her lips. He's sleeping, she whispered, leading him to the couch where Matthew was curled up under a soft throw blanket. Jerry stood looking at his son, really looking at him, for the first time in longer than he cared to admit. Timothy's face was peaceful in sleep, one hand clutching a small dinosaur toy that Chelsea must have given him. He cried for about 10 minutes after you left, Chelsea said quietly. I think he was scared you wouldn't come back. Jerry felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. But I always come back. Do you? Chelsea asked gently. Or do you come back distracted, thinking about the next meeting, the next crisis? Matthew can feel when you're not really there. Jerry sank into Chelsea's Kit Davidson chair, the weight of 8 years of emotional absence crashing over him. I don't know how to be what he needs. Chelsea sat across from him, her voice soft but steady. He doesn't need you to be anything other than his dad. Not his manager, not his therapist, not his provider. Just his dad. She reached across the small table and touched David's hand. The way you looked at him today when he laughed at the park, that's what he needs. That's all any child needs. To be seen and loved for exactly who they are. Jerry turned his hand palm up, catching Chelsea's fingers in his. How do you know all this? Chelsea's smile was sad and knowing. Because I spent 18 years waiting for someone to look at me that way. And I've spent the 6 years since then learning that sometimes you have to become the person you needed when you were small. In that moment, Jerry understood that Chelsea hadn't just helped him see Matthew clearly. She'd shown him that love wasn't about being perfect or having all the answers. Love was about showing up, again and again, with an open heart. Even when you were terrified of getting it wrong. The shift happened gradually over the next 2 weeks, so subtle at first that Jerry almost didn't notice. But Chelsea saw it, the way David's shoulders relaxed when he walked into the diner, how his voice softened when he spoke to Timothy, the increasing frequency of his genuine laughter. It started with small changes. Jerry began scheduling his meetings around Timothy's needs instead of the other way around. He bought a set of adaptive toys that Chelsea had mentioned, not from some expensive catalog, but from the same discount store where Chelsea shopped. Most importantly, he started getting down on Timothy's level, literally sitting on floors, crouching beside his wheelchair, meeting his son's eyes when they talked. "You're different," Chelsea observed one afternoon as they sat in the park. Matthew was in his wheelchair beside the playground, watching other children with his usual bright interest, while Jerry made up elaborate stories about the adventures the kids were having. "Different how?" Jerry asked, though he kept his attention on Timothy, describing how the little girl on the swings was actually a superhero testing her flying powers. "Lighter," Chelsea said simply. "Like you're not carrying the weight of the world anymore." Jerry glanced at her, struck by the observation. "I think I was carrying the weight of trying to be something I'm not. Perfect father, perfect provider, perfect everything. Turns out Matthew doesn't need perfect. He just needs present." Chelsea smiled, that warm expression that had become David's favorite sight in the world. "Took you long enough to figure that out." "I had a good teacher," Jerry said quietly. The words hung between them, loaded with meaning neither was quite ready to examine. But the air felt charged, full of possibility and dangerous hope. Their routine had evolved into something that felt almost like family. Jerry would pick up Chelsea after her morning shift, and they'd spend afternoons together, sometimes at the park, sometimes at the Children's Museum, occasionally at David's penthouse where Chelsea would help Matthew with his physical therapy exercises while making them feel like games. David's penthouse had transformed during these visits. Chelsea had brought color and warmth to the sterile space. Crayons scattered on the marble coffee table, picture books stacked on expensive furniture, the sound of laughter echoing off walls that had only known silence and business calls. "You know what Matthew needs," Chelsea said one afternoon, watching him struggle to reach a toy that had fallen just beyond his grasp. "Independence. He's smart enough to problem solve, but everyone always jumps in to help before he can figure it out himself." David's first instinct was to retrieve the toy immediately, but Chelsea caught his arm. "Wait," she said softly. "Let him try." They watched Matthew study the problem, then use his wheelchair's joystick to position himself differently. It took several attempts, but finally he was able to reach the toy himself. His face lit up with pride and accomplishment. "I would have just handed it to him," Jerry admitted. "I know. Most people would. But Matthew deserves the chance to succeed on his own, even if it takes longer." Chelsea began bringing small projects for Timothy, simple puzzles designed for his motor skills, art supplies that worked with his abilities, books that celebrated children with disabilities as heroes of their own stories. She never made a big deal of these things, just quietly introduced them into their time together. "Where do you find all this stuff?" Jerry asked one day, watching Matthew paint with adaptive brushes that Chelsea had somehow located. Chelsea shrugged. "You learn to be resourceful when you don't have much money. There's this amazing thing called the internet, and if you know where to look, you can find anything." Jerry felt a familiar twist of guilt about the vast difference in their resources. "Chelsea, if you need." "I don't," she said firmly, but without hostility. "I need to do this myself, David. I need to know I can take care of myself." Jerry was beginning to understand that Chelsea's independence wasn't just preference, it was survival. She'd learned early that depending on others led to disappointment, and she'd built her entire life around self-sufficiency. But he also saw the loneliness in her eyes sometimes, the way she watched him and Matthew together with a mixture of joy and wistfulness. As if she was witnessing something beautiful that she could never quite be part of. One evening, Jerry made a decision that surprised even him. Instead of dropping Chelsea off at her apartment after their afternoon together, he asked, "Would you like to stay for dinner? I could cook." Chelsea raised an eyebrow. "You can cook?" "I can order from very expensive restaurants and pretend I cooked," Jerry said with mock seriousness. "It's a highly developed skill." Chelsea laughed, and the sound sent warmth through David's chest. "In that case, I'd love to stay." Dinner was a revelation. Not the food, which was indeed excellent takeout from David's favorite Italian place, but the feeling of sitting around a table like a real family. Matthew was more animated than usual, chattering in his limited but expressive way, clearly delighted to have both his favorite people in the same place. "He's never this talkative with strangers," Jerry said, watching Matthew attempt to tell Chelsea a complex story involving dinosaurs and spaceships. "I'm not a stranger," Chelsea replied simply. "I'm Timothy's friend." After dinner, they settled in the living room with Matthew between them on the couch. Chelsea had brought a new book, a story about a little boy who used a wheelchair and became a race car driver. As she read, her voice taking on different character voices, Jerry found himself watching her more than the book. Chelsea Whitney was beautiful, but it wasn't just her physical appearance that drew him. It was the way she moved through the world with quiet strength, the way she found joy in small moments, the way she loved Matthew without reservation or pity. She was everything Jerry hadn't known he was looking for. When Matthew fell asleep against Chelsea's shoulder, she didn't move to disturb him. Jerry carefully lifted his son to carry him to bed, and Chelsea followed to help with Timothy's nighttime routine. "I should go," Chelsea said softly after they'd tucked Matthew in. "It's getting late." But Jerry didn't want her to leave. The penthouse felt different with Chelsea in it, warmer, more alive, more like a home than the sterile showplace it had been. "Chelsea," he said as they stood in his foyer, suddenly nervous in a way he hadn't been since high school. "Can I ask you something?" She nodded, though something cautious flickered in her expression. "Are you happy? I mean, really happy? Working 3 jobs, barely sleeping, pushing yourself so hard." Chelsea was quiet for a long moment. "I'm surviving," she said finally. "That's different than happy, but it's enough." "What if it didn't have to be enough?" Jerry asked softly. "What if you could have more?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications that made Chelsea's heart race and her defenses rise simultaneously. "David," she said carefully, "what are you asking me?" Jerry took a step closer, close enough that Chelsea could smell his cologne, could see the uncertainty in his eyes that matched her own. "I'm asking if you think there might be something here, between us. Because I can't stop thinking about you, Chelsea. About how you make everything better just by being in it. About how Matthew lights up when he sees you, and how I do too. About how my life felt empty before you walked into it." Chelsea's breath caught. She dreamed of someone saying words like these to her, but now that it was happening, all she could think about were the 1,000 ways it could go wrong. "We're from completely different worlds," she whispered. "So what?" Jerry said, reaching up to touch her cheek. "Matthew doesn't care about different worlds. He just knows that you love him. And I know that I'm falling in love with you." The words hit Chelsea like a physical blow. Love. She'd heard the word before, from foster parents who'd used it as manipulation, from boyfriends who'd used it as currency. But the way Jerry said it, looking at her like she was precious and necessary and real, that was new. "David," she started, but he shook his head. "You don't have to say anything back. I just needed you to know. Whatever this is between us, wherever it goes, you should know that you've changed our lives. You've changed me." Chelsea looked at this man who had everything money could buy but had been missing the things that mattered most. She thought about Timothy's laughter, about the way Jerry had learned to be present, about how the 3 of them had started to feel like something she'd never had before, a family. Instead of answering with words, Chelsea stood on her tiptoes and kissed him. Soft at first, tentative, then deeper as David's arms came around her waist and pulled her closer. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Chelsea rested her forehead against his chest. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Of what?" Jerry asked, his voice gentle. "Of believing this is real. Of depending on someone again. Of letting myself hope for something that feels too good to be true." Jerry tipped her chin up so she was looking at him. "Then don't depend on me. Let me depend on you. Let me be the one who's scared of losing something precious." Chelsea felt tears prick her eyes. "You want to depend on me?" "Chelsea, you've shown me how to be a father to my son. You've brought light and laughter into our lives. You've made us a family. If that's not worth depending on, I don't know what is." For the first time in her life, Chelsea Whitney felt truly seen, truly valued, truly loved for exactly who she was. And for the first time in 8 years, Jerry Davidson felt like he'd found his way home. In each other, they'd discovered what they'd been searching for all along, someone brave enough to stay. 3 weeks after that first kiss, Jerry Davidson felt like he was living in a different life entirely. The morning started with Timothy's excited chatter about seeing Chelsea, afternoons were filled with laughter and discovery, and evenings ended with quiet conversations after Matthew went to sleep. For the first time since Lynn's death, David's penthouse felt like a home, which made what happened on a Tuesday morning all the more devastating. Jerry was in his office, reviewing quarterly reports while Matthew worked with his physical therapist in the next room, when his assistant Rebecca knocked on the door. "Mr. Davidson? Richard Morrison is here with the Yamamoto executives. They said it was urgent." Jerry frowned. The follow-up meeting with the Tokyo division wasn't scheduled until Thursday. "Send them in." Richard Morrison entered with 3 impeccably dressed Japanese businessmen, their expressions carefully neutral. Jerry had worked with Hiroshi Yamamoto long enough to recognize when something was seriously wrong. "Yamamoto-san," Jerry said, standing to bow respectfully. "This is unexpected. Please sit." "We prefer to stand," Yamamoto replied in precise English. "We have concerns about your company's stability, Davidson-san." Jerry felt ice form in his stomach. "Stability? Our financial reports." "Not financial stability," Richard interrupted, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Personal stability. Professional judgment." Yamamoto reached into his briefcase and withdrew a tablet, swiping to a photograph that made David's blood freeze. It was a picture of him, Chelsea, and Matthew at the park, taken with a telephoto lens. Chelsea was pushing Timothy's wheelchair while Jerry walked beside them, his hand resting on Chelsea's lower back. They looked like exactly what they were, a family. "This woman," Yamamoto said, "we understand she is a waitress? Someone you met at a restaurant." "Her name is Chelsea," Jerry said carefully, though his mind was racing. How had they gotten this photo? Who had been watching them? Richard stepped forward, his expression grim. "David, do you have any idea how this looks? A $50 million deal on the table, and you're playing house with some girl you picked up at a diner." "She's not some girl," Jerry said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Isn't she?" Richard pulled out his own phone, scrolling through what looked like a background check. Chelsea Whitney, 24, high school dropout, multiple jobs, no significant assets. Foster care system until 18. "David, she's a fortune hunter who saw you coming from a mile away." David's hands clenched into fists. "You had her investigated?" "Of course I did. You've been acting completely out of character for weeks. Missing meetings, leaving early, making decisions based on emotion instead of logic. I had to protect our interests." Yamamoto spoke again, his tone disappointed. "In Japan, we believe that a man's judgment in personal matters reflects his judgment in business matters. If you cannot see this woman for what she obviously is, how can we trust your assessment of our partnership?" "What she obviously is," Jerry repeated, his voice rising. "And what's that?" "A opportunist," Richard said bluntly. "Look at the facts, David. Beautiful young woman, working multiple jobs, suddenly becomes involved with a billionaire single father? It's the oldest con in the book." "She doesn't even know how much money I have," Jerry shot back. "Please," Richard scoffed. "Your penthouse, your car, your clothes. She'd have to be blind not to know you're wealthy. And I'm sure she's already calculated exactly how much your son's medical needs make you vulnerable to someone who shows him attention." The words hit Jerry like physical blows, not because he believed them, but because he could hear how they sounded to outsiders. He thought about Chelsea's reluctance to accept help, her insistence on paying her own way, her discomfort with expensive gifts. But doubt was a poison, and Richard's words contained just enough surface logic to make it spread. "The bottom line," Yamamoto said, "is that we cannot do business with someone whose judgment is so obviously compromised. Until you resolve this situation, our partnership is on hold." They left without another word, Richard shooting Jerry a look that promised a much longer conversation later. Jerry stood alone in his office, staring at the photograph on the tablet they'd left behind. Chelsea looked radiant in the picture, her face lit up with genuine joy as she interacted with Timothy. Jerry looked happier than he'd been in years. Matthew was clearly delighted to be with both of them. It was a picture of a family. But through the lens of business associates looking for weakness, Jerry could see how it might look like something else entirely. His phone buzzed with a text from Chelsea. "Matthew and I are at the museum. The dinosaur exhibit is making him very happy. Wish you could see his face." Jerry stared at the message, Richard's words echoing in his head. Was Chelsea playing a long game? Had she targeted Matthew specifically because she knew a devoted father would be vulnerable to anyone who showed his disabled son kindness? The thoughts felt like betrayal even as they formed, but Jerry couldn't stop them. Chelsea had appeared in their lives at exactly the right moment, had known exactly what to say and do to win Timothy's affection. She'd been studying child development. Wouldn't she know exactly how to manipulate a child's emotions? David's reflection was interrupted by Timothy's delighted laughter from the next room. Through the open door, he could see his son working with Janet, the physical therapist, but Matthew kept looking toward the door expectantly. "Dada, Chelsea?" Matthew asked hopefully. "Not today, sweetie," Janet said gently. "Chelsea's not coming today." Timothy's face fell, and Jerry felt a fresh wave of anger, though he couldn't tell if it was anger at Richard for planting these doubts, or at Chelsea for making Matthew so dependent on her presence. What if Richard was right? What if Matthew got hurt when Chelsea inevitably moved on to a better opportunity? What if David's son's heart got broken because Jerry had been too lonely and desperate to see clearly? An hour later, Chelsea arrived at the penthouse with Timothy, both of them glowing from their museum adventure. Matthew was chattering excitedly about a massive T-Rex skeleton, using the few words he could manage and elaborate gestures to describe its size. "You should have seen him with the interactive displays," Chelsea told David, helping Matthew out of his jacket. "He figured out how to make the dinosaur sounds work, and then he spent 20 minutes teaching other kids how to do it. I think he might be a natural teacher." Chelsea's face was radiant with pride and affection for Timothy, and Jerry felt his chest tighten with conflicting emotions. Either Chelsea was genuinely invested in his son's happiness, or she was the most skilled manipulator he'd ever encountered. "David." Chelsea's voice broke through his thoughts. "Are you okay? You seem distant." Jerry looked at her, really looked at her. Chelsea Whitney, with her second-hand clothes and her bright smile and her infinite patience with his son. Chelsea, who worked 3 jobs and studied at night and had never asked him for anything except the chance to spend time with Timothy. Chelsea, who had transformed his family in ways he'd never thought possible. But Richard's voice was still echoing in his head. "She's a fortune hunter who saw you coming from a mile away." "I'm fine," Jerry said, his voice cooler than he intended. "Just work stress." Chelsea's expression shifted, sensing the change in his tone. "The Yamamoto deal? You know about that?" Jerry asked, and immediately hated himself for the suspicion in his voice. "You mentioned it last week," Chelsea said slowly. "You said it was important." Had he mentioned it? Jerry couldn't remember. Everything about the past few weeks felt blurred together, colored by emotions he tried so hard to keep buried. "David, what's wrong?" Chelsea asked directly. "Something's changed. You're looking at me like you don't trust me." Matthew had picked up on the tension in the room. He made a distressed sound and reached for Chelsea's hand, then for David's, trying to pull them together the way he always did when he sensed discord. Jerry pulled his hand away. The gesture was small, reflexive, but it might as well have been a slap across Chelsea's face. She stepped back, hurt and confusion clear in her expression. I think maybe I should go, Chelsea said quietly. Maybe you should, Jerry replied, the words feeling like acid in his throat. Chelsea stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for some explanation. When she didn't find one, she knelt down to Timothy's level. I have to go now, sweetie, she said softly, her voice thick with unshed tears. But I'll see you soon, okay? Matthew began to cry, reaching for Chelsea as she stood up. The sound of his son's distress should have broken David's resolve, but Richard's words were too loud in his head. Chelsea looked at Jerry one more time, her eyes bright with tears and something that looked like heartbreak. I don't know what I did wrong, she whispered. But I'm sorry. She left without another word, leaving Jerry alone with his crying son and the terrible certainty that he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. But by then, it was too late to take it back. Matthew cried for 2 hours straight, and no amount of comfort from Jerry could console him. Because for the first time in his young life, Matthew had experienced what it felt like to have a family. And Jerry had just torn it apart. Here's something I want to know from you. Have you ever had a moment where fear made you push away something good? What would you have done in David's situation? Share your thoughts in the comments. As the evening stretched on and Matthew finally exhausted himself into fitful sleep, Jerry sat alone in his pristine penthouse, surrounded by all the wealth and success that suddenly felt meaningless. He'd protected himself from being vulnerable. But in doing so, he destroyed the only thing that had made him feel truly alive. Jerry Davidson hadn't slept in 3 days. Matthew refused to eat, spending his days listlessly staring out the penthouse windows, occasionally making the soft sound that meant Chelsea in his limited vocabulary. The physical therapist couldn't engage him. The speech therapist gave up after 20 minutes. Even Janet, who had worked with Matthew for 2 years, looked at Jerry with barely concealed frustration. He's grieving, she said bluntly on Thursday morning. Children with special needs often form intense attachments to people who understand them. Where's Chelsea? David's jaw tightened. She's not available. Well, figure out how to make her available. This child is heartbroken. After Janet left, Jerry found himself standing in Timothy's room, watching his son sleep. Timothy's face, even in rest, looked sad in a way that made David's chest ache. His son had experienced love, real, unconditional love, and Jerry had ripped it away based on suspicion and fear. David's phone had been buzzing with messages from Richard about the Yamamoto deal, about damage control, about moving forward with their business partnership. But every time Jerry tried to focus on the contracts and negotiations, all he could think about was Chelsea's face when he pulled his hand away from hers. I don't know what I did wrong, but I'm sorry. The words haunted him. Chelsea had apologized for something she hadn't done, had accepted blame for David's fear and Richard's prejudice with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned early that she would always be found guilty of something. By Friday morning, Jerry couldn't take it anymore. He called his private investigator, not to dig up dirt on Chelsea, but to find out who had been watching them, who had taken those photographs. The answer came back within hours. Richard Morrison had hired the photographer. Richard, his business partner of 5 years, his supposed friend, had orchestrated the entire confrontation with the Yamamoto executives. The urgent meeting, the background check, the implications about Chelsea's motives, all of it had been theater designed to make Jerry choose business over his personal life. "You son of a bitch," Jerry said when Richard answered his phone. "I assume the investigation is complete?" Richard replied calmly. "Good. Now you can see I was protecting you." "Protecting me? You manipulated me into destroying the best thing that's happened to my family in 8 years. David, be rational. A waitress with no education, no background, no resources? She was using you. For what?" Jerry demanded. "Chelsea never asked me for money, never asked for gifts, never even asked for my last name until I told her. She worked 3 jobs while spending her free time with Matthew because she genuinely cared about him. She was playing the long game." "No," Jerry cut him off. "You were playing the long game. You've been trying to control my personal life for years because you think it affects our business. Well, congratulations, Richard. You won. Chelsea's gone, Timothy's heartbroken, and I'm miserable. Was it worth it? The Yamamoto deal. Fuck the Yamamoto deal, Jerry said, a sentence he'd never imagined speaking. If they can't do business with someone who's found love, then I don't want their money. Jerry hung up and immediately called his lawyer to begin the process of buying out Richard's share of the company. If it took every dollar he had, he would sever ties with the man who had poisoned the best thing in his life. But even as Jerry took action against Richard, he knew the harder conversation was still ahead of him. He'd spent 3 days trying to figure out how to apologize to Chelsea, how to explain that his fear had made him cruel, how to convince her to give them another chance. The problem was, Jerry wasn't sure he deserved another chance. Chelsea, meanwhile, was drowning. She'd thrown herself into work with desperate energy, picking up extra shifts at the diner, taking on additional cleaning jobs, staying busy enough that she couldn't think about David's cold dismissal or Timothy's heartbroken crying. But late at night, alone in her small apartment, the pain caught up with her. She'd been foolish to believe that someone like Jerry Davidson could actually love someone like her. Foster kids learned early that fairy tales didn't happen to people like them. Rich men didn't fall in love with waitresses except in movies, and when they did pay attention to women from her background, it was temporary, a novelty that wore off once reality set in. What hurt most wasn't David's rejection. Chelsea had been rejected before and survived. What hurt was that she'd started to believe she could be part of something beautiful. She'd let herself imagine a future where she could help Matthew grow up, where she could build the family she'd never had, where love was possible for someone who'd never been anyone's first choice. Stupid, she whispered to herself, staring at a picture Matthew had drawn for her, a stick-figure family with 3 people holding hands. She'd been carrying it in her purse, planning to frame it for her apartment. Chelsea's phone buzzed with a text from her roommate Jessica. There's some guy in an expensive suit downstairs asking for you. Says his name is David. Chelsea's heart stopped. She looked out her apartment window and saw David's Tesla parked on the street, Jerry himself standing on the sidewalk looking up at her building with an expression she couldn't read from 4 stories up. She thought about ignoring him, about telling Jessica to send him away. Jerry had made his choice when he'd pulled his hand away from hers, when he'd let her leave without explanation or fight. But then Chelsea thought about Timothy's laugh, about the way Jerry had learned to get down on his son's level, about the morning Jerry had told her he was falling in love with her. Maybe she owed it to Timothy, to all of them, to at least listen. Tell him I'll be down in 5 minutes, Chelsea texted back. Jerry was pacing when Chelsea emerged from her building, his expensive suit rumpled and his usually perfect hair disheveled. When he saw her, he stopped moving entirely, his expression shifting through relief, hope, and something that looked like terror. Chelsea, he said, her name coming out like a prayer. What are you doing here, David? Chelsea asked, crossing her arms over her chest in unconscious self-protection. I came to apologize. And to explain. And to beg you to forgive me for being the biggest idiot in the history of idiots. Despite herself, Chelsea felt her mouth twitch at his words. That's a pretty comprehensive list. I'm just getting started, Jerry said. Chelsea, I was wrong. About everything. I let fear and other people's poisonous opinions make me doubt what I knew in my heart was real. Which was what? Chelsea asked quietly. Jerry stepped closer, close enough that she could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the genuine anguish in his expression. That you loved Timothy. That you changed our lives in the most beautiful way possible. That what we have together, the 3 of us, is real and precious and worth fighting for. Chelsea felt tears prick her eyes, but she wasn't ready to forgive him yet. So what changed? Why are you here now? Jerry took a deep breath. Because Matthew hasn't eaten properly in 3 days. Because he keeps asking for you and I can't give him an answer that makes sense. Because I realize that protecting myself from being hurt isn't worth destroying the happiness of the 2 people I love most in the world. The two people you love most, Chelsea repeated. You and Timothy, Jerry said simply. Chelsea, I love you. Not because you're good with Timothy, not because you make my life easier, but because you're brave and kind and real in a way that makes everything else feel shallow. I love you because you see the best in people, even when they don't deserve it. I love you because you made me want to be a better father and a better man. Chelsea wiped away a tear that had escaped despite her efforts. Your business partners can go to hell, Jerry said firmly. I've already started the process of buying out the partner who orchestrated this whole mess. And if other people can't accept the woman I love, then they're not people I want to do business with. David, Chelsea started, but he held up a hand. I know I don't deserve another chance. I know I hurt you and I broke Timothy's heart and I probably destroyed your trust in me. But Chelsea, I'm asking anyway. Not because I have any right to ask, but because what we had was real. What we could have is worth fighting for. Chelsea looked at this powerful, successful man who was standing on a sidewalk in her neighborhood, rumpled and desperate and offering her his heart. 3 days ago, she would have said yes immediately. But 3 days ago, she hadn't experienced the devastating pain of believing she wasn't good enough. How do I know you won't change your mind again? Chelsea asked. How do I know that the next time someone questions your judgment, you won't decide I'm not worth the trouble? Jerry reached into his jacket and pulled out a small velvet box. Chelsea's breath caught. Because I want to marry you, Jerry said. Not someday, not eventually, but as soon as you'll have me. I want to adopt you into this family officially, legally, permanently. I want Matthew to have the mother he deserves, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving that you can trust me with your heart. Chelsea stared at the ring box, her mind reeling. David, we've known each other for a month. I've known you were extraordinary since the first day you helped Matthew eat his lunch. I've known I was falling in love with you since you told me about Marcus in the foster home. I've known I wanted to spend my life with you since the night you stayed for dinner and made my house feel like a home. Jerry dropped to one knee right there on the sidewalk, oblivious to the curious stares of Chelsea's neighbors. Chelsea Whitney, will you marry me? Will you be Timothy's mom and my partner and the center of our family? Will you let me spend the rest of my life making sure you never doubt how much you're loved? Chelsea looked down at this man who had somehow become everything she'd never dared to dream of. She thought about Timothy's bright eyes and infectious laughter. She thought about the way Jerry had learned to be present, to be real, to be the father his son needed. She thought about the family they could build together, not perfect, but real and loving and chosen. Yes, Chelsea whispered, then louder, yes, David. I'll marry you. As Jerry slipped the ring onto her finger and stood to kiss her, Chelsea realized that sometimes the most broken people could heal each other. And sometimes, love really was enough to overcome any obstacle, even fear. 6 months later, Chelsea Davidson stood in the Kit Davidson of what was now truly their home, watching her husband attempt to make pancakes while their son directed the operation from his wheelchair with the authority of a seasoned chef. More blueberries, Dada, Matthew said clearly, his speech having improved dramatically since Chelsea had started working with him using techniques she'd learned in her child development classes. Classes Jerry now paid for, not as charity, but as an investment in their family's future. More blueberries, Jerry agreed solemnly, adding what appeared to be half the container to the batter. Anything else, Chef Timothy? Matthew giggled, a sound that still made Chelsea's heart swell every time she heard it. Chocolate chips. Absolutely not, Chelsea called from where she was packing Timothy's backpack for his new school. We've already pushed the boundaries of breakfast nutrition enough for one morning. Jerry caught her eye and winked, then conspiratorially whispered to Timothy, we'll add them when Mama's not looking. I heard that, Chelsea said, but she was smiling. This was their morning routine now, Jerry making increasingly elaborate breakfasts while Chelsea prepared for their days, Matthew serving as quality control supervisor for both operations. The wedding had been small and perfect, held in the same park where Chelsea had first learned to see Jerry as more than just a guilty father. Matthew had been the ring bearer, his wheelchair decorated with flowers and ribbons, his face glowing with joy at being the center of attention for all the right reasons. Chelsea had worn a simple dress from a boutique downtown, not a designer gown, but something that felt like her. Jerry had worn a suit that cost more than Chelsea's first car, but had gotten it rumpled within the first hour from rolling around on the grass with Matthew after the ceremony. The guest list had been carefully curated. David's brother James and his family, a few close friends, some of Chelsea's fellow students from her early childhood development program. Notably absent was Richard Morrison, whose partnership Jerry had bought out with extreme satisfaction. The Yamamoto deal had eventually gone through with a different partner, one who had met Chelsea and Matthew over dinner and declared them a most harmonious family. Hiroshi Yamamoto had even brought gifts for Timothy, an elaborate toy dinosaur that roared when you pressed its stomach. Business partnerships, Yamamoto had told David, work best when both parties understand what truly matters in life. Now, Chelsea worked part-time at a specialized therapy center for children with disabilities, using her degree and her natural empathy to help other families find their way. She'd kept her position at Rosie's Diner for 2 mornings a week, not because she needed the money, but because she loved the work and the people. Some things shouldn't change just because your circumstances do, she told Jerry when he'd questioned why she wanted to keep waiting tables. Jerry had learned to understand this. Chelsea's independence wasn't stubbornness. It was part of who she was, part of what made her the strong, self-reliant woman he'd fallen in love with. He'd learned to support her choices rather than trying to manage them. Matthew had started at a new school, an inclusive program where his differences were accommodated rather than seen as problems to be fixed. His teacher, Mrs. Patterson, had been amazed by his progress in communication and social skills. He's clearly being raised in an environment full of love and understanding, she told Chelsea during their first parent conference. Whatever you're doing at home, keep doing it. Chelsea had squeezed David's hand under the conference table, both of them remembering a time when Timothy's needs had felt insurmountable rather than simply different. Now, as Chelsea watched Jerry flip pancakes with theatrical flair while Matthew cheered, she marveled at how normal this all felt. Not the wealth. She was still adjusting to having a house cleaner and not checking her bank balance before buying groceries. But the family part. The love part. The having people who were excited to see you every morning part. Mama, look. Matthew called, pointing to where Jerry was attempting to flip a pancake and catch it in the pan. The pancake landed on the floor with a splat, and Matthew dissolved into giggles. Very impressive, Dada, Chelsea said solemnly. I think you've invented a new cooking technique. It's called feeding the dog we don't have, Jerry replied, already starting a new pancake. Highly advanced culinary skill. Chelsea walked over and kissed him, tasting blueberries and happiness. I love you, you ridiculous man. I love you too, Jerry murmured against her lips. Both of you. More than I ever thought possible. Over breakfast, they discussed their plans for the day. Matthew had physical therapy in the afternoon, which Chelsea would attend while Jerry handled a conference call with his new business partners, people who had met and approved of his family before they'd even discussed profit margins. Oh, Chelsea said, remembering, I got a letter yesterday from Marcus. Jerry looked up, recognizing the name of the boy from Chelsea's foster home, the one who had inspired her career path. He's graduating from high school next month, Chelsea continued, her voice thick with emotion. He got into college. With a full scholarship. His letter said he wanted to thank me for being the first person who made him feel like he had a voice, even when he couldn't speak. Jerry reached across the table and took her hand. He found his voice because you showed him he had one. Just like you did for Timothy. Just like you did for me. Timothy, sensing the emotional weight of the conversation, reached out and covered their joined hands with his own small one. Family, he said clearly, a word that had become his favorite. Family, Chelsea agreed, her heart full of wonder at this life she'd never dared to dream of. Later that evening, after Timothy's therapy session and David's meetings and Chelsea's work at the therapy center, they found themselves back in their usual spot, the corner booth at Rosie's Diner, where their story had begun. Chelsea still worked the Tuesday morning shift here, and she'd insisted they continue their weekly family dinners at the diner. Some traditions are too important to abandon, she told David. Now, as Chelsea helped Matthew with his dinner, Jerry watched them with the same amazement he'd felt that first day. But this time, there was no anxiety, no feeling of inadequacy. He'd learned to trust Chelsea's expertise while developing his own. He'd learned that being a good father didn't mean being perfect, it meant being present. "Remember the first time we sat here?" Chelsea asked, glancing around the familiar diner. "You mean when I was a nervous wreck who couldn't feed his own son?" Jerry replied, "I mean when I met two of the most important people in my life," Chelsea corrected gently. "When I discovered that family isn't about blood or biology or even circumstances. It's about choosing to love each other again and again, especially when it's hard." Matthew looked up from his mac and cheese, now eaten independently with adaptive utensils, no Captain Mac stories required, and smiled at both of them. "Love you, Mama. Love you, Dada." The words still brought tears to Chelsea's eyes. Matthew had started calling her Mama 3 months ago, entirely on his own. The first time he'd said it, Chelsea had cried for an hour, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming joy of finally belonging somewhere. "We love you too, sweet boy," Chelsea said, ruffling his hair. As they prepared to leave the diner, Chelsea noticed a young father at a nearby table struggling to help his toddler daughter with her soup. The little girl was getting frustrated, the father was getting flustered, and other diners were starting to stare. Chelsea caught David's eye and nodded toward the table. Without needing to discuss it, they understood each other perfectly. "Excuse me," Chelsea said gently, approaching the table. "I hope you don't mind, but I couldn't help noticing. Would you like a suggestion that might help?" The father looked up, relief clear in his expression. "Please. I'm terrible at this." "No, you're not," Chelsea said firmly. "You're learning. We all are." As Chelsea knelt beside the little girl and began transforming the soup spoon into a tiny boat sailing across a sea of broth, Jerry watched with a familiar warmth that came from witnessing Chelsea's gift in action. Some things never changed. Chelsea would always see children who needed encouragement, parents who needed support, people who needed to know they weren't alone in their struggles. But some things had changed completely. Chelsea now had a family who supported her calling, resources to help more children, and the security to take risks in service of love. Jerry now had a partner who understood that strength came from vulnerability, that love was an action rather than just a feeling, and that the most successful life was one filled with laughter and purpose rather than just profit. And Matthew now had parents who saw his potential rather than his limitations, who celebrated his progress without diminishing his worth, who loved him exactly as he was while helping him become everything he could be. As they walked to their car, Matthew between them in his wheelchair, Chelsea and Jerry each holding one of his hands, Jerry realized this was what happiness looked like. Not the absence of challenges. Matthew would always need extra support. Chelsea would always carry the scars of her difficult childhood. Jerry would always struggle with the fear of not being enough. But happiness was facing those challenges together. Happiness was choosing love over fear, vulnerability over protection, connection over control. As they drove home through the city lights, Matthew chattering about his day from the back seat, Chelsea reached over and took David's hand. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" Jerry asked, though he suspected he knew. "For showing me that home isn't a place," Chelsea said. "It's people who choose to stay, even when staying is scary." Jerry brought her hand to his lips, kissing her wedding ring, a simple band that meant more to him than all his business successes combined. "Thank you for teaching me that love isn't something you earn," he replied. "It's something you give, freely and completely, and trust that it will come back to you." In the back seat, Matthew had fallen asleep, exhausted from a day full of learning and loving and being loved in return. And in the front seat, Chelsea and Jerry Davidson drove toward home, not the penthouse with its expensive furniture and city views, but the home they'd built together, one laugh and one meal and one act of choosing each other at a time. 3 years later, Chelsea stood in the delivery room holding their newborn daughter, Isabella, while Jerry helped Matthew meet his baby sister for the first time. "She's perfect," Matthew said in his clearer speech, gently touching Isabella's tiny hand. "Just like our family." Chelsea looked at Jerry over their children's heads, both of them remembering that day in the diner when their worlds had collided in the most beautiful way possible. What started with a simple act of kindness over mac and cheese had become a legacy of love that would ripple through generations. Matthew would grow up knowing he was valued exactly as he was. Isabella would learn from birth that families come in all forms and that love multiplies when shared. And Chelsea and Jerry would continue building their foundation of trust and vulnerability, proving every day that sometimes the greatest fortunes couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. Sometimes the greatest riches were found in a corner booth at a small diner, in the laughter of children, and in the courage to believe that everyone deserved to be loved completely. Love, they discovered, really was the greatest investment of all. What lesson from Chelsea, David, and Timothy's journey resonates most with you? How do you define true wealth in your own life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for joining this journey of discovery, redemption, and the bridges we build to connect across the divides that separate us. Share your thoughts about second chances and the hidden gifts of the people around us. We'd love to hear your stories of unexpected connections that changed everything. Please like, subscribe, and share because every story of choosing love over fear matters.